episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. We have a guest on the show today, Matthew Ho. And Matthew was a decorated captain in the Marine Corps and then worked in the State Department as part of the provincial reconstruction team in Afghanistan. And back in 2009, Matt came out and blew the whistle on the Afghan surge when there was a big public relations campaign from the Pentagon to force Obama into escalating the war in Afghanistan. Matthew heroically came out and publicly said, "Do not do this. It's not going to work." And spoiler alert, they still did do it. Matthew, how's it going today? We appreciate you joining us.
Good. Thank you for having me here, guys.
Hey, Matt, how hard is it for you not to go around screaming, "I told you so" all day long? I'm thinking maybe you should get it tattooed on you somewhere.
It's actually, there's really, there's not really any joy in it, I mean, particularly because maybe if those who had pushed these wars, sustained them, lied about them, cheerled for them, maybe if they were getting some form of justice, like, a lot of the generals, politicians, media figures, think tankers, if they were in stocks right now in the public square, yeah, I'd be happy to walk in front of them and smack them in the face or whatever, and right, but they're not. I mean, there's no justice. It's just a tragedy of proportions that, here in the U.S. we can't imagine. When I speak to international audiences, sometimes they can get it, I spoke to a Japanese reporter recently, as well as a Spanish reporter, and I said, I think you can understand what Afghanistan has been like because of your own experience with the wars, with World War II or the Spanish Civil War, and the devastation that it brought
Right.
to your countries, but just imagine even cases of the Japanese where the Japanese, it was really just a few years where the Japanese people were affected directly in terms of United States air attacks against the homeland, the Japanese homeland.
Mm-hmm.
This has been 40 plus years of war in Afghanistan. So I mean the catastrophe and the tragedy of this is just so immense. It's unimaginable. So, but no, I certainly do fantasize. I mean, I fantasize about, these people in DC, especially, or in London, receiving some form of justice, of some form of vengeance being taken upon them. Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't be human if I said otherwise. But yeah, no, it is really nothing to be happy about at this point. Yeah.
I feel that, and maybe just shedding some light on the issue is the best way for us to go towards some semblance of justice.
Matt, if you could just take us back to 2009 and just tell us what you were doing in Afghanistan and why you ended up resigning in protest.
Yeah, I was a foreign service officer. As a political officer, I had received a direct appointment into the Foreign Service because I have worked with the State Department before. As a consultant and as well as a Department of Defense official. I've been on State Department teams in Iraq from 04 to 05, and then as a consultant on the Iraq desk after that. And and I had spent 10 years in the Marine Corps as well, including one time as a Marine Corps company commander in Iraq. So I end up in Afghanistan in 09. I get there in April of 09. As part of the escalation of the war. I mean, people are very familiar with the surge of Afghanistan in the fall of 2009 and debate around that. What's always so interesting to me is that there is very little discussion about the preliminary escalation of the war prior to that discussion, and the fact that Barack Obama actually sent more troops, in the first half of 2009 than he did in the second half. So that whole great discussion of the surge in Afghanistan results in Barack Obama sending 30,000 more U.S. troops. He goes to West Point December of 2009, makes that big speech, sends 30,000 more troops after months of public discussion and debate and theater. But prior to that, he had sent about 40,000 more troops with any discussion. And that culminates too, I think, in what I'm seeing right now in a lot of the commentary, just either ignorance that is sincere or willful about how big this war actually was, this feeling that somehow we didn't try hard enough in the Afghan war, when the reality is that within a year of Barack Obama taking office, a year and a half within Barack Obama taking office, there is a 250 million man Western Army in Afghanistan, 100,000 U.S. troops, 40,000 NATO troops, and over 100,000 contractors. So just to kind of remind people where the war was at that point, the decision point by the administration to escalate the war. And I had gone to Afghanistan after being in Iraq twice, being already morally and intellectually broken at that point, drinking heavily, being suicidal, and really a real conflict within me in terms of my participation in these wars and continuing to do so, but thinking that Afghanistan was a different war than Iraq, as well as that somehow that the Obama administration would pursue these wars differently than the Bush administration did. And I get to Afghanistan in 2009 as a political officer, thinking that I would be doing things similar to what had been done in Iraq in 2006 and 2007 in terms of answering the grievances of the Sunnis that fueled so much of the insurgency in Iraq. That culminated with the Anbar Awakening and the Sons of Iraq and the very real drop in violence that occurred, that was temporary, but that did occur from 2007, through about 2011, 2012. I thought that's what we were going to be doing, that we were going to be speaking to the Taliban, trying to bring about a political solution, as we had sort of temporarily done in Iraq with the Sunni insurgency. But it didn't take me very long being in Afghanistan to see that was not the case. The war in Afghanistan was fundamentally no different than the war in Iraq. We could sit here all day and just kind of come up with what are the differences between Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the different ways they are different. But the reality is, as long as that either nation was occupied by the U.S. military, where the goal was simply military victory, there was no other differences that mattered between the countries. And the fact that, again, with the Obama administration, it was fundamentally no different than the Bush administration, as it was seeking military victory in Afghanistan for the sake of domestic politics, for the glory of the presidency, basically. So
well,
after being there 5 months, I
Iraq
resigned. What's that? I'm sorry.
Well, what makes Iraq and Afghanistan different? And by no means am I trying to say the war in Iraq was a success, but at the very least, as far as metrics are concerned, the government that we put in power, the essentially Shia chauvinist government we put in power, is still the government in Iraq, and the government we put in power in Afghanistan is gone. So what were the major differences, and why was that state able to survive and the Afghan state that we propped up not able to survive?
Well, I think you did not have a destruction of the Iraqi government the way that the Afghan government had been destroyed in the 1990s. A very purposeful destruction via civil war and foreign manipulation, foreign involvement, by the United States, the Pakistanis, the Indians to a degree, the Saudis, the Iranians were involved as well. After, there's a big mistake, there's a very, very serious mistake and flaw in so much of the commentary in the United States about Afghanistan. So much of that goes back to that terrible movie, Charlie Wilson's War. Hey, it's an enjoyable movie. Tom Hanks is great. However, in terms of that's what you understand about Afghanistan, that's where your history lesson is. You're for a very rude awakening if you ever actually, read something else or talk to an Afghan. The main thing about Charlie Wilson's War that is so wrong is at the end, Tom Hanks is standing on the balcony with, I forget who he's standing on the balcony with, in the film, but he says how the whole point about how we're abandoning in Afghanistan and the foreshadowing of what was going to occur, of course, with 9/11. The reality was we did not abandon Afghanistan when the Soviet Union left. The United States stayed in Afghanistan along with the Saudis, the Pakistanis, etc., and spent hundreds of millions of dollars every year up until 1992 when the communist government fell to destroy the communist government. And to the point, the destruction of the communist government being the sole, being the primary desire of the American government, not the replacement of the government with some kind of interim government or something like that, but rather just we need to destroy this communist government so that we have final victory. And then that of course leads into the terrible inner fighting between the Mujahideen groups that result in the desolation of any type of government structure in Afghanistan. And it also had been more or less a very decentralized, very rudimentary, incapable government structure to begin with. I mean, that's one of the reasons in Afghanistan you have these this political tension that becomes war, is because there are those in Afghanistan who want to build Afghanistan, who want to, we would call them now socialists and communists, but much of their intention was to bring Afghanistan into the modern world. Afghanistan had no infrastructure, it had no industry, it had no schools in the 1970s. So when the king is overthrown in 1973, that is part of it, and that thus begins a really great rural urban conflict, secular versus religious, modern versus traditional, however you want to frame it, conflict. I think that's one of the primary differences you have between Iraq and Afghanistan, is that they really, in 2001, you're really rebuilding a government from ashes, because even when the Taliban had been in control most of the country for 5 years at that point, they really were not, no one was going to confuse the Taliban, for any type of government that was out there providing services for the people, So the United States, when it went into Afghanistan, was really trying to, and took this attitude that it was rebuilding things from scratch, where, there was an absence of infrastructure, and there was an absence of mechanisms, and there certainly was an absence of a central government that could deliver things to the people. However, there have been traditional means things were done, and there have been successful ways for things to have been done. And certainly building a government and a society and infrastructure and civil society, et cetera, in the midst of a civil war that you are, as the United States is, actively promoting, particularly through its divide and conquer strategy that it had in Afghanistan, there's no way you're going to build anything. Iraq, of course, is different, because when the United States goes into Iraq in 2003, while it chases away and destroys much of the human capital within Iraq, at least the physical presence, the physical infrastructure, the bureaucratic infrastructure, the mechanisms of government are still in place. So I think that was part of it. And you also had the difference between the people that the U.S. put in power in both countries, I think, is crucial too. I think with Iraq, the United States puts in power these Shia political parties, many of them, if not most of them, aligned with Iran, backed by Iran, controlled by Iran, basically. But these political parties that are interested in taking power and exercising power, while, and then delivering based upon their ideology, right? Based upon their political premises, based upon, they wanted control, but they also wanted to be the government and do what government does. In Afghanistan, what we put in power was warlords and drug lords. We built a kleptocracy. We built a government of thieves. Many people this past week have been talking about Sarah Chase's book, State of Thieves, which describes, I think, pretty well who we put in power in Afghanistan. So, that was a difference there, just in the sense of that we put, thieves, warlords, war criminals, thugs, drug lords, as the power base in Afghanistan, in control of the government that was trying to be built. And so that was just built out as a mechanism to feed these people, so that they could steal, so that they could prey upon people. While in Afghanistan, the people we put in power, by no means saints, but at least were filling a government that had a shell and had some interest in providing services, fulfilling the functions of government. Not saying that the Iraqi government isn't corrupt as all get out. It certainly is. It's just that the people in power had at least a desire to exercise the functions of government, for the purposes of control, but also understanding that we need to deliver services in order to maintain this control. While in Afghanistan, it was just complete looting.
Well, can you go over some examples of corruption that you saw in the Afghan government when you were because you were in the State Department on the reconstruction team. So, did you ever see any kind of like fraud in terms of like stuffing ballots or just any type of like financial fraud? Like what exactly was going on? Because I guess I'm just trying to realize the scope of the corruption in Iraq in the Afghan government.
Oh, it was, it was built as a kleptocracy. It was built to feed the greed and the profit of warlords and drug lords. I mean, that was the purposes of it. I mean, just in the sense even, and that's how so much of the governments have been sort of before. I mean, there's not a lot of, the communist government in the 1980s, comparably not as corrupt as the government of the last 2 decades, but still in many ways was not seen by particularly people in the rural areas as a government, for the people, and you could, and then certainly under the king, the king ruled in a very decentralized manner for 40 some odd years, and by and large kept the peace, but there were certainly people who were paying up what they needed to pay up to keep their positions as as tribal leaders, as regional leaders, as for their control of provinces, cities, villages, etc. But with what I saw personally in terms of how corrupt this government was, which is just amazingly corrupt. I mean, with the elections, I ended up, I was there for the 2009 presidential elections. I ended up at an Afghan army base that day. I can't even remember why I was over there. But I was, and there was supposed to be no election material, balloting, anything going on the army bases. And literally in the room I was sitting in, there was like 2 large folding tables with probably 3 or 4 ballot boxes on them each. And I'm just sitting there watching the Afghan soldiers put ballots into them. Completely unconcerned that I'm there. I mean, the scope of the fraud, the whole election had been set up in such a way that there was going to be no oversight, that there was going to be no control on it.
People, who are they voting for?
They were Karzai, Hamid Karzai. Yeah, Hamid Karzai. What you had was, so you had that. And that's a lot of the way with the corruption. It was just set up. It was fundamentally built into the systems of government, right? I mean, so in the mechanisms and the things that were supposedly controls. So one of the things about why these ballot boxes were on this Afghan army post was because this was, even though there was thousands of independent election observers from all around the world who came, their ability to watch the election process seemed, if you read it up front, seemed like, oh, pretty good. We're going to have election observers at all the polling stations and stuff like that. But there were never any election observers once the balloting was over, and those ballot boxes were then moved to an area where they're going to be counted and everything. I mean, that was all considered. That was all, and the way it was phrased was that this way the ballot boxes are under lock and key. No one will interfere. No one will see it. No one will be present. But basically what it did was they were basically excluding any oversight at all at that point, keeping the ballot boxes hidden from the world. In between the stages of voting and counting, you had, this mass ballot stuffing and this, and it was all done very openly in that sense, because this is part of the process, right? You were going to have this, where even election observers won't need to be there, because this is going to be such a pure control process. It can't be tainted. Well, except for the fact that the people actually running the election are the people who want to win the election. There is no, and they would be called the Afghan Independent Election Commission, and the idea that was independent we see this a lot, right? We say it's one thing, whether it be regardless of who it is, who is in power. They'll say one thing and it sounds good. The rhetoric is there, but of course the reality is something else. The same thing too with, say, the construction, the process for bidding on construction and reconstruction and rebuilding efforts and that kind of thing. In the province I was in Zabul province, when they had this day where contractors came in to bid on work, I was not allowed to be present for it, even though it was all American dollars that were being utilized. The Afghan government was the only ones who were allowed to be there, and it was framed as, this way we're keeping the process pure. This way it's a purely independent Afghan government process. I mean, you had this a lot, like that corruption that was just built in, right? So, exactly, this is what happened. The governor ran this, and whoever said they were going to give the most money to the governor got the project. That's how the bidding worked. I mean, it was clear. And one of the things that was done, though, was that, anyone who might have been a witness to it was excluded. And honest to God, the U.S. Embassy would cheer that this is the right way to do it. You see, the Afghans are doing it themselves, that this is a way to maintain integrity. There are no outsiders involved. There's no bias. There's no, on and on. And this even extends to this idea that somehow the Afghan government, again, a government built with warlords and drug lords at the very top, so the whole thing, again, was going to be just a feeding mechanism for them. I mean, even when it came time to deal with negotiations with the insurgency, which could have occurred in 2009, it could have occurred all this time. I mean, when I was in Afghanistan, we had the Taliban in the east, in Kunar and Nangarhar province. The Taliban up there came in wanting to talk to us in 2009. And when I was in the south of Afghanistan, in Zabul, Taliban interlocutors met with me, and the message was basically, look, we're tired of fighting. Our grandfathers fought, our fathers fought, we're fighting, our sons are fighting. We don't want our grandsons to fight, but we're not going to surrender, and my response when I would turn around to the embassy with this was simply, again, this is an independent, this is for the Afghans to handle, right? That this is a question of reconciliation. Is an Afghan only question. Is up to the Afghan government to handle this, with this idea that somehow the Afghan government is this pure government of democratic virtue that is somehow going to address these things in a manner that is best for the Afghan people. The reality, right, is that, like, okay, we're propping up and keeping in power this kleptocracy. They would be the last ones of anyone to negotiate away any of this gravy train they are on. Mm-hmm. But that was the response to us, was this whole charade of basically kind of like covering our eyes and ears and making pretend it's not happening just because we say it's not happening.
I was just going to ask the same.
You saw that over and over and over again.
I was just going to ask the same question. Like, is this, as far as our involvement in this whole process, is this willful ignorance or is this just abject incompetence?
It's both.
Both.
It's both. It's both. It is absolutely both. It's a lot of men and women from the West go there with, I think, good intentions, think that they're going to make a difference because they believe the narrative. They believe that we are changing things for the better in Afghanistan. And then they get there and they see the scale of the corruption, the scale of the brutality of the Afghan government. I mean, maybe the Afghan government was not as theatrical in its brutality, and including its misogyny as the Taliban was, but it certainly was there. The Afghan government was just much better at hiding it, right? As well as having the cover and support of the United States and the occupation to, cover up these things, not discuss these things, as well as a primarily pliant international media that went along with the narrative. Now, there certainly are plenty of media sources that reported on the corruption, reported on the brutality of the Afghan government, the misogyny of the Afghan government, etc. But those stories were in between, just kind of just rough spots or potholes along an otherwise, super highway of narrative that what the United States is doing in Afghanistan is to rebuild a country in our image, that we are doing good things for the Afghan people, that the Afghan government may have its flaws, but it's really trying. When, again, the actuality of it is that the United States built a government of warlords and drug lords, and the results that the consequences of that were exactly what you would expect. And so there was the willful ignorance, there was the sincere ignorance, there was a degree of romance to it. One of the biggest warlords and drug lords in the country is a guy named Gul Aga Shirzai. Shirzai was the warlord who the Taliban overthrew in Kandahar in 1993, 1994. The origin story of the Taliban, how much of it's true or not, I don't know, but at least the myth of it is strong enough and rings true enough that it provided the Taliban with a pretty great degree of popular support in the mid-90s. Was that the Taliban rose up, against these warlords to bring justice to the land, to make people feel safe, to protect people's children, et cetera, et cetera. Shirzai being the head warlord in Kandahar, the United States puts him back in power in Kandahar when we come back in. I mean, so literally the person that the Taliban supposedly rose up against, to try and bring about, right, in their origin story, and how much is true or not, I'm not sure, but there is a truth to that, or an element of truth. And
Karzai, it's their truth.
Karzai is the guy. Shirzai is the guy we put in power. Well, Shirzai, when I'm there in 2009, is now in charge of Nangarhar province. He has all his poppy fields in the south. I could tell you stories about the drugs with him, of course. But he is a warlord. He's a war criminal. He is a thug. He controls Nangarhar, which Nangarhar has the most important border crossing in terms of economically with Pakistan for Afghanistan, and also if it's not the biggest border crossing, it's the second biggest border crossing in Afghanistan. As everyone knows, Afghanistan is a landlocked country. You kind of get an idea how important border crossings are. He's in charge of that, so he's taking what he wants and needs from that. He is a thug, like I said, but the romance with him by U.S. diplomats and U.S. generals is that this guy is our Tony Soprano, and there was in this guy Shirzai, who had the dancing boys, who trafficked and raped young boys. He did that very clear. We all knew that, but he's our Tony Soprano. So there was this romance to that with these figures, because they seemed oriental, right? They seemed dangerous. These were men who did what they needed to survive, and we'll pal with them because, and basically very much a ends justifies the means kind of interpretation for what we are doing in Afghanistan. So that's a long way of saying that, along with the willful ignorance and some pretty sincere ignorance, you also had an ends justifies the means, a continual rationalization, a continual explanation for what we're doing there, that most people, by the time they were done with their 9 months, 1 year, however long in Afghanistan, had seen through, but now they were done with it and they were moving on and going home. I mean, I got that feeling so many times from civilians over there, except for those who are the true believers or whatever, that, let me just get through this. Let me just get done with this, and then I don't have to ever do this again, And then with the military, what you saw in terms of your rationale for being there is the military among officers and among enlisted becomes, let me take care of my guys. I've got it. I don't want to hear about this. I know about this. I don't want to think about this, but if I don't take care of my guys and gals, who is, right? And so that is kind of the predominant way that many Americans get through their deployments, because the corruption and everything, the thieving, the looting, the human rights violations. I mean, the human rights violations of the Afghan government were, extravagant. Well, let me just get through this, take care of the people around me, and then, with their civilians, they never had to do it again. If they're military, if I get sent back here again, it's about taking care of the people around me, about me doing my personal best, and about me being a moral person in an immoral situation, which I think, as most people recognize, that's only going to go so far.
Well, tell me this. How many officers agreed with your position when you resigned in 2009?
Almost everyone, with the exception of the General McChrystal, General Petraeus, and their people around them, who, honest to God, I met with a lot of them when I was leaving. And honest to God, they're at it. Two of them who were senior people for General McChrystal there. General McChrystal was in charge of the Afghan war. Literally, their argument to me was like, look, if General McChrystal agreed, if this was correct, General McChrystal would agree to it and we would be doing it. I mean, there was a cult around these generals that was very real. I mean, I think people, we don't want to ascribe to these massive events, to these major historical events, to these things that cause death, suffering, life-changing events to millions and millions of people, that there are very personal issues involved, that they're very, oftentimes these things can be moved and controlled and influenced just by the singular people that are involved, and you saw this with much of the U.S. military senior leadership, how there was a cult that formed around these generals, this cult of counterinsurgency, and then it became like, this idea that, okay, well, we just have to kill harder, when Petraeus takes over, and any evidence to the contrary, the fact that you can't show where this has been successful, the contortions they go through to say that counterinsurgency has ever worked, when it's quite clear it never really has. I mean, the examples that these counterinsurgency fanatics or adherents point. Coinistas, yes, thank you. Yeah, the coinistas that the contortions they put themselves through to try and convince people that this worked. I mean, their examples are incredibly scarce, and those examples usually having major flaws with them, or caveats to them, or simply it would not apply to these circumstances. So among these people, you had, one of the major coinistas was a guy named John Nagel, who very important in terms of both the Iraq War and Afghan War, in terms of overall strategy and who's talking to the media and who is actually influencing what the U.S. military puts in front of the president in terms of options and what is happening and what should be happening. His big thing was about Malaysia. Malaysia is the example we should use. The British lost Malaysia. You know what I mean? You just had even things that are that clear, like so getting back to the whether this was willful ignorance or not, I think you had people who were just charlatans, who were snake oil salesmen, who were in here peddling things that because they wanted to begin. If you understand warfare, you understand that there have been generations of warfare. First generation warfare, you start with muskets and guys online, right? Second generation, third generation, etc. Now we're in the late fourth generation, I guess, or beginning of the fifth. I don't know. I don't care. But these people do, right? These people do, and they want to be known as the architects of the next generation of warfare, as well as two guys like Petraeus and McChrystal. They want to be the Eisenhowers and Pattons and MacArthurs of their generation. Let's not forget they were. Let's not forget, there were members of Congress who put forward for David Petraeus to have a 5th star. For him to be a general of the armies, that's real. They're members of Congress.
Was that political though, just so he can have a transition to a presidency or something like that? There was a lot
of that concern. The idea that there is, I think, probably maybe some credence to the idea that Barack Obama appoints David Petraeus director of CIA, so it keeps him out of the 2012 Republican presidential race, right? There is that idea that you go back 12 years or so, there is a lot of talk about Petraeus becoming president, and certainly a fifth star, which would put him in terms of, that would put him with the, the United States had 8 or 9 5-star generals and admirals in World War II, and those are the only ones we've ever had, and it's the idea that he would be put in the pantheon with the generals and admirals who defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, right? That is, that is what someone like him has been doing everything his entire life for. Here's a guy who goes to West Point and immediately, or not immediately, but eventually ends up like marrying the commandant of West Point's daughter, right? Talk about a guy, don't tell me that this person did not scheme that. That's exactly who General Petraeus is. You had this cult. Petraeus is such a great example because Petraeus goes to Iraq with in command of the 101st Air Assault Division, and he's in charge of Mosul in the first year of the war. And by the end of their time in Mosul, Petraeus and his staff are reporting back to military headquarters that things are going well in Mosul. There's some rough spots, but for the most part, things are going well. The unit that goes into Mosul after him walks into a complete shit show. Terrible. Absolute violence, explodes, and what basically had been happening was Petraeus had been lying about this, that his people had been cooking the books, fudging the numbers, and reporting that things in Mosul were much better than they were, just to show that Petraeus is doing such a great job. Petraeus takes over the training command in Iraq, which is at this point, 04, this is the way the United States is going to get out of Iraq, right? By building up the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police. He takes over this training command. Well, 2 things happen under his time on the training command. One, they lose hundreds of thousands of rifles and pistols. Gone. No accounting for these weapons. Hundreds of thousands of weapons just disappear in Iraq under Petraeus' command. Second thing that happens is that this is also the time where the Iraqi civil war, which is a consequence of our actions, but the Iraqi civil war really starts to spin, right? Really starts to pick up speed. And a lot of this, and it becomes not just a civil war, but becomes a genocidal civil war. And a lot of this is because Petraeus is under his command, right? In short, this is how the Iraqi police and army are being stood up and trained and put out there. Particularly the Iraqi police, Shia militias really take control of the policing units. And that is a major step, a major part of the Iraqi civil war, exasperating, but also becoming genocidal. So, under Petraeus, that's Petraeus' experience going into the fall of 2004. And what we have to remember then, that Petraeus in October of 04, as Bush is running against Kerry for presidency, Petraeus writes an op-ed for, the Washington Post, I believe, or the New York Times, I can't remember off the top of my head. But basically, if you read this op-ed, you have a general in Iraq, not just any general, the most famous American general since Norman Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell, and arguably since General Westmoreland in terms of influence, Westmoreland being in Vietnam. Petraeus at this point has already been on the cover of Newsweek, I believe twice maybe. One time the cover says, I think he may have only been on the cover once by this point. But anyway, regardless, the cover of Newsweek says, "Is this the man who can save Iraq?" He's all over the television. He is the media darling. He is a celebrity general. And after the complete catastrophe of his time in Iraq at this point, he writes this op-ed endorsing Bush for president in 04. So again, not just any general, but the biggest celebrity general out there, the one that all Americans know, and we're told this is the man who's going to save Iraq. He basically says you have to vote for Bush in order for us to win this war, right? Bush wins election and everything. In any other just or sane society, government, military, a person like that would have been removed, would have been fired, would have been court-martialed even, for any of those things. Any of those things. What he did in Mosul, what he did in the training command, writing an op-ed, endorsing someone for president. But what happens? Petraeus gets promoted again. He gets put in charge of as commander-in-chief of the war in Iraq. He goes on to command Central Command, so he's in charge of all the United States wars. He then goes on to become director of Central Intelligence, so you can, it's a long story, but I think that explains to people that the sycophants were very real, that the cult of the celebrity generals was incredibly real, that this counterinsurgency dogma had a very had almost a religious type fervor to it, where if you disagreed, you were blasphemous, that this was anathema, as well as too, if you disagreed in any manner, you were outside of the bubble. You were someone who could not be trusted. You were someone who would not be listened to. I mean, remember with General McChrystal, the late Michael Hastings. God, I wish Michael was still with us.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I wanted to ask you, have you ever seen a film, War Machine? With
No, I haven't, and there's some personal reasons for that. But please go ahead.
Oh, okay. It is funny. It is very funny in the way they portray Stanley McChrystal. I've been told that it is accurate. Like Brad Pitt does a good job. But yeah, talk about Michael Hastings' piece in the Rolling Stones, and what eventually happened to McChrystal and all that stuff.
Yeah,
if I could just cut you guys off for just 1 second, I want to be respectful of your time, Matt. I know we booked 12 to 1. We're coming up on 1 here, and I know you said you had another one.
I can go for another 45 minutes or so.
Awesome. I just want to keep track of time.
Right?
We're totally open.
Yeah, we do like hour and a half podcast, but whenever you got to go, just let us know.
Okay, thank you.
Just wanted to be respectful of your time, that's all. We got a couple of questions that we wanted to ask anyway, so this is great.
I appreciate it. And I appreciate the ability to tell these stories. I'm so glad I'm here talking with you guys and not just yammering on about I don't know, the evacuation. Not that it's not important, not that it's not dear, not that tragic, but like I think it's important for people to understand how these wars were filled out, what they were constructed on, who drove them, how these things were possible. That's how we get to this point in Afghanistan. That's how we get to this point where Joe Biden can really be presented with no options other than pull out of Afghanistan or escalate the war again, right? There's a lot of this is how we get to this point. But with Michael Hastings, he writes that piece in Rolling Stone, The Runaway General, about General Stanley McChrystal. Actually, there was some justice involved in all that, and for me personally, because the man who arranged for that interview for Michael Hastings to be with General McChrystal for weeks at a time, basically, right, to do this high-profile biopic for Rolling Stone, was a guy named Duncan Boothby. I know Duncan Boothby because when I resigned, and about a month after I resigned, the Washington Post wrote a big story on me, and I was all over television, media, and everything. And when that occurred, Central Command under David Petraeus hired a strategic communications firm to discredit me. They, basically telling producers I was lying about who I was, just discrediting me in general, but also to giving media notice that if, as one time when I interviewed with Dan Rather, and I saw the message basically from this strategic communication period to Dan Rather's producers, the message basically is, if this is the kind of guy, referring to me, that you guys want to deal with, you're not the kind of people we want to deal with, right? And then 3 or 4 weeks later, after spending 3 or 4 hours being interviewed by Dan Rather, probably about 3 hours, after them bringing me up from DC to New York for this interview, as we're doing B-roll on in Midtown Manhattan, Dan Rather saying to me, I know you're right because I've been going to Afghanistan for 3 decades, so I know you're right. After all of that, and then seeing this message that came in while we were taping, if this is the kind of guy you want to work with, you're not the kind of people we want to work with. 3 or 4 weeks later, I'm nowhere to be seen, and Dan Rather's show, I think it was called Dan Rather Reports at the time, it was on a cable network, but sure enough, Dan Rather's talking to all these generals, he's over in Afghanistan, right? So there's very real that, but I know Duncan Boothby because at a Christmas party at the Army Navy Club in Washington, D.C. that year. This guy walks up to me and he says, I just want to introduce yourself because I'm the one who's leading the effort to discredit you to the media, and shakes my hand and everything and says his name is Duncan Boothby. So Boothby goes on to set up Michael Hastings with General McChrystal, and then of course Michael writes a very honest and straightforward, telling of what it is like to be around General McChrystal for a few weeks, and it's incredibly unflattering. It shows, I think, just kind of things we were talking about, like the cult of the celebrity general, the refusal to listen to any outside voices. I think you see that where, if I remember correctly from the Rolling Stone piece, he's very dismissive of Biden, doesn't like Biden because Biden didn't agree with him. Biden wanted a counter-terror strategy in Afghanistan, which, to show you how petty and insane so much of this is and how much it's so personal, Biden's counterterrorism strategy that he claims was, and he said this a couple weeks ago when talking about Afghanistan, which he claims was his opposition to the surge, which is complete bullshit. He didn't oppose the surge because under Biden's counterterrorism strategy, rather than having 100,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, there would have been 90,000 U.S. troops. But
10K.
even that, right? I mean, difference of 10,000. Mm-hmm. But even that 10,000 difference, just the fact that Biden was saying send 20,000 troops, McChrystal was saying send 40,000 troops, Obama splits the difference, right? As I think most people would not be surprised, Obama split the difference and went with what's in the middle. Sends 30,000 troops December 2009. Even that, if you read that piece, how dismissive McChrystal is of the vice president because the vice president didn't fully agree with him. But then you see how much they liked Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton, of course, wanted to escalate the war. I mean, Hillary Clinton's never seen a war she didn't want, or I mean, her comments now about what's happening in Afghanistan are some of the best comments you could get from a warmonger. But so the Rolling Stone piece, in addition to dismissing Biden or being dismissive of Biden, it's also General McChrystal is very dismissive of the President of the United States. And to Barack Obama's credit, he fired General McChrystal. I don't know if that would happen now. This is in the spring of 2010, May or June of 2010. I don't know if that would happen now. I think the relationship between civilian and military authorities it's very problematic and very dangerous for the American people right now. But Barack Obama does fire General McChrystal to assert, civilian control of the authority of the military. I mean, that is the system we have, and that's the system we should have. I say it's very dangerous right now is because, as I just said, Joe Biden is kind of given no option when he comes into the Oval Office about what to do in Afghanistan other than withdraw or escalate the war. And I believe he did the right thing, of course, by withdrawing. But you have to say, look, the Doha Agreement with the Taliban was signed February 2020. There has been 18 months now since the signing of the agreement, and what we're seeing happen in Kabul. When Joe Biden comes into office in January, the United States military has basically refused to continue the withdrawal from Afghanistan. They refused under Trump, rather than getting all the troops out like Trump kind of wanted to, I believe, before he left office. He had to cut that in half, slow that down, because the U.S. military refuses. The U.S. military supposedly tells Joe Biden when he asked about meeting the May 1st deadline for getting out of Afghanistan, and presumably he's asking them in January or February that, oh, it's impossible. We can't get it done by then to get these remaining 2,500 troops out of Afghanistan. That's too quick of time. It's too dangerous. Logistics are too intense. Well, finally, when Joe Biden says we're around May 1st that we're going to get all U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, the United States military pretty much does it within 2 months. So you had this thing of like, wait a minute, hang on. I thought you guys just a few months ago said it was too dangerous, too difficult to do in a few months, and now you get it done in 2 months, and you're saying things to the media like speed equals safety. You're flat out lying to the President of the United States then. So, and if it was, I just want to make sure people get that this is not the sole concern. You also have issues just in July. The White House has basically said, and good for them for doing this, I agree with them, that no drone strikes will occur without approval from the White House, without approval from the National Security Council. The U.S. military launched a drone strike in Somalia in July, or maybe beginning of this month, that was in direct defiance of that order. They launched a drone strike without approval from civilian authorities. Direct conflict, direct countermand of a lawful order from civilian authorities. The Pentagon felt that it didn't need to go by that it didn't meet the Pentagon felt like it had other reasons that it could follow rather than listen to the civilian authority. And the other point too, and there are a lot, we can go into all kinds of things, but just to give you a third example of why this is dangerous is, remember, under Donald Trump, the U.S. military lies to Donald Trump about how many troops it has in Syria, right? And whatever you think about Donald Trump, that's not the issue. The issue is you have the U.S. military disobeying and lying to the elected president of the United States. And if people think we have problems with our democracy now, which we do, it's going to be a lot worse if this trend continues with the U.S. military. But I'm sorry, go ahead, Danny.
No, I was just going to ask, we don't often have, people with military backgrounds on, but when we do, I always like to ask them from their perspective, how these things pan out, like on the ground, from your perspective, that 2-month, estimate, and then they're saying that it's very dangerous. Can you talk me through like what are kind of the logistics around pulling out? And maybe you can comment a little bit on the exit date or the exit strategy that we originally telegraphed and that we amended and then amended again. Yeah. And just tell me like from a logistic perspective, from a military perspective, what is what are the pros and cons? What are the drawbacks? Like, what are the things that we have to think about when we're doing something like this?
Well, it's massive. I mean, it is massive. Both the retreat from Afghanistan and from Iraq is breathtaking in the size of it, and in the scope of how much had to be moved. Not in terms of people, which was also a good amount, but the numbers of troops, continually drew down in both countries over the years, right? But the amount of material that had to be removed, hardware that arrived over time in both Iraq and Afghanistan. In both Afghanistan and Iraq, most of that material had to be shipped over land. A lot was flown out, but a lot of it, and you're talking major pieces of equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery pieces, communications equipment. I mean, all kinds of stuff. Anything you can think of, had to be moved. And there was so much stuff that just couldn't be moved because there was so much stuff there. So you think about all the stuff that we used to cook with, right? All the weight sets, all the gyms, I mean, like all the beds, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All the bunks, all those trailers. I mean, like so many of the Americans and the Westerners that were over there, we lived in these trailers, these what we called shoes, containerized housing units, which are just basically that, like a Connex box, a trailer built out as a little sleeping facility.
I think they call those tiny homes now.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's why I'm not a fan. This idea we're going to give tiny homes to all these homeless people, and I've lived in a tiny home. That's not gonna work.
Millennials love this stuff. We should just set up Airbnb in like Kabul or something like that, and just make this the new destination spot.
Yeah. So right. I mean, but the I was actually just saying this to a friend of mine I was having dinner with last night, who is still involved with all of this on the civilian side, and I wish that, and maybe there has been, if there has and I missed it, if someone could, contact me and let me know, a documentary done on particularly like the withdrawal, the retreat from Iraq, and what that meant in terms of the logistics, like the scale of it, like how many trucks we needed to move that stuff out of Iraq overland to Kuwait, and get it back on ships and everything else. Right. The same way too with Afghanistan, everything that had to go back out through Pakistan. The how many containers was that? What does that look like? At some point there must have been, I know there were marshaling yards for this where things were collected and we put on trucks and is there video of that? Because it's staggering how much that is. I was there, and I don't think I have a good understanding of how much there was. So in terms of the logistics, it is a massive effort. It is one thing that the U.S. military does do well, which is a shame. I mean, I say it's about the U.S. military all the time. Look, we bring together every year, we bring together young men and young women from all across the United States. We put them into really, we give them training. We give them all kinds of responsibility. We teach them how to do things. They work with other people they would never have met in their lives. I mean, and the end point of it is to kill people, right? Imagine if we did this for the sake of some aspect of humanity, and you could see that it could be possible because of when
the logistics.
The logistics, and you see what just occurred in Kabul with the evacuation, where this is. I haven't seen any updates today, but as of Friday, the 27th, I think the number of people evacuated was 110,000. I mean, you're talking about 110,000 people evacuated from one runway, basically, which is another reason people want to get pissed off, ask what the hell did, I mean, the United States spent hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, on the Kabul airport, and there's basically only one functional runway there. So, I mean, just not to, if people are not irate and upset enough, you can go down that rabbit hole of where did that money go to, right? But, from one runway in the middle of a city controlled by a victorious enemy, the United States evacuates 110,000 people at least. I mean, with a couple more days of evacuation still to come. I mean, the scale of it is again, simply awe-inspiring in terms of just the actual movement of people and things. Now, the way it was carried out, certainly be criticized up and down, but I think what was asked of the U.S. military, and anyone who knows me knows I'm not one to give out a lot of compliments to the U.S. military, but what was asked of the U.S. military in the last couple weeks and what they delivered is simply incredible. And I think the point to be taken from that is that we can do things. We have a choice. Look, I mean, tens of millions of Americans saw video these past weeks of American Marines holding babies, giving bottles of water to the babies, children in the airport, lifting babies up to safety or perceived safety, right? Freedom. You got these videos of Marines lifting babies over blast wall to the other side, to the airport, symbolizing, out of this crushing crowd of violent, scary, desperate brown people, right? You have the white American Marine lifting this baby to safety over the blast wall to the, everything that behind that represents freedom, liberty, prosperity, apple pie, etc. Right? I mean, you have that video and tens of millions of Americans have seen that. That is a choice that we have as a country that we can do. We can act as those individual Marines and soldiers were doing. However, our institutions for the last 20 years have chosen to do the exact opposite. And again, when you see something like this airlift in Kabul, you realize that, look, the United States military and the United States, if given the right purposes, can actually do things that are of benefit. However, the institutions and those that lead them have chosen so many times, nearly all the time, not to do that.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's the takeaway I wish more people would have with this evacuation is that what is possible, particularly as we have very real systemic existential threats, not just to our society, but to the planet, whether, the climate crisis or the pandemic or what have you.
I mean, I keep coming back to the timelines and the difficulty there. And thank you so much for shedding, even more light on how incredibly, Herculean the effort is in order to move all that stuff out. But I keep coming back to this because, we didn't need to give them 2 months to do it. We could have been drawing down over time, right? We didn't need to, front load all this stuff. And then we also see the opposite side of it, where, okay, we moved 100,000 people, but there's 100,000 more that still need to go, right? And we moved God knows how many metric tons of equipment and hardware out of the country, but there's still millions of metric tons, still in the country that are now obviously in the hands of the Taliban. So, what's the deal there? Why
Well, I
Is this
think
is this like, are we saying that we did a good job, or are we saying that we didn't do a good job? Because I kind of see both, you know.
Yeah, and I think you can see both, and we should. And I think the fact that so much of these wars, like so much else in our society, is dominated by a binary discussion, right? And more than often, it's dominated by Team Red versus Team Blue.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, so
everything's partisan.
it's possible, right? It's possible for both things to be true. It's possible for the United States to do an amazing job evacuating people, and for it still to be completely fucked up, right? I mean, both things are true. I mean, like it's that duality. I mean, duality is nothing new. I mean, this is. I mean, the duality has people in societies have been aware of duality. You know, if gosh, you know, I mean, this is the two natures of man, et cetera. That is something that's very real. We've known as a species for as long as, you know, we've been able to put thought together and speech together, that there is this duality, and that plays out in our actions, right? That plays out in our events. So yeah, I mean, this idea that, and of course we could have done things better, and we should have done things better with regards to our Afghan allies. U.S. veterans groups and human rights groups have been jumping up and down, I mean, screaming about this for at least 8 years, probably longer. The earliest, I went back and looked it up just to make sure I wasn't crazy, but the earliest thing I found was from the Associated Press in 2013 with U.S. veterans groups saying, hey, we need to get these guys home. We need to bring our allies and their families to the United States. I mean, that was 8 years ago. I'm pretty certain it begins in 2011 when Barack Obama announces that the surge in Afghanistan is ending, and we're drawing down troops, and we'll be transitioning it over to our Afghan allies to run and win the war. I'm quite certain that at that point there were veterans groups, human rights groups, refugee groups, et cetera, saying we need to do something about these people. So this is simply not anything that occurred in the last couple months. This is something that people have neglected, have obfuscated. Certainly under the Trump administration it was harder because, I mean, you had, just their view in terms of any immigration was, they weren't going to have it. You know, I mean, with a guy like Stephen Miller in charge, how were any Afghan refugees going to get here? But this is something that predates that. This is the problem that goes back to the Obama administration.
Right.
So certainly, why, how come, and why, as well as too, what happened in the last 18 months? Again, the Doha Agreement was signed between the Taliban and the United States in February of 2020. 18 months occurred between this point. For the most point, the Taliban, yeah, they had an offensive in 2020 that was pretty serious offensive. I mean, their offensives get bigger and bigger every year. That's a good idea of understanding why the United States has been losing this war. Every year, the Taliban gets stronger in ways that can be objectively measured and understood, right? They literally shoot more bullets than the year before, right? They have more people shooting bullets than they did the year before. They are bigger and stronger. I mean, as well as like all kinds of other ways you can look at it. But I mean, so they did. But you know, starting this year, you see this offensive that they launched that is at least a year, probably longer in the making, in which for the most part was quite bloodless. Or relatively bloodless. I mean, it was very violent, don't get me wrong, but for what could have been, you have most of the cities, the provincial capitals, the border crossings, the road networks, et cetera, that Taliban took, there was relatively little fighting, and I use the term relative, to compare it to what you might have thought would have happened, what it would have been like, and certainly what the conquest of cities in Afghanistan has looked like in the past. You know, basically, you know, and so the Taliban certainly utilized this past year and a half, couple years to put together an offensive that would bring them victory in this phase of the war. And I want to say this phase of the war because what occurs next is still unknown. And this could be a cruel peace where the Taliban consolidate power, and it's a cruel peace and they have won, or United States. And I guarantee you, there are people in Washington D.C. right now who are looking at these warlords that are still opposed to the to the Taliban, these warlords that are in the Panjshir Valley, to the Hazaras, in their
the ones we
the
put there in the first place.
Yes, exactly. That they are looking at this and they're saying, you know what? This isn't very different than September 10th, 2001, right? Or September 11th, 2001, or September 12th, 2001. The Taliban control most of the country. There are these warlords holding out against them. And I guarantee you guys, there are men and women in Washington, D.C. saying, we did it once before, we can do it again, but this time we'll do it better, right? Because that's the hubris that drives so much of this, right?
Nuts.
Yeah, I mean, so what did the United States do during these 18 months? What did the Afghan government do during these 18 months? Well, we know the American military dragged its feet quite a bit. I'm under the opinion that the American military was telling the Afghan government that we are not really leaving. That whoever wins in November will not actually pull us out. And so basically kind of sabotaging, as well as like giving mixed messages at best to the Afghan government. Again, a government, a kleptocratic government, a government patriots network, a business venture basically. So giving them no reason or incentive to pursue negotiations with the Taliban, because that's what's supposed to have had occurred in these last 18 months between February 2020 and May 2021, when the United States was supposed to pull all its troops out. There were supposed to have been further talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and those did not occur. A variety of different reasons. I put most of the blame on the Americans, and then for not forcing the Afghan government to do more, to talk more, to realize the position they were in. Taliban have been winning this war for at least 12 years, in my opinion. They have had all the leverage. They have all the leverage. And so the idea that somehow that the Taliban were not going to do anything, that May 1st, 2021 was going to come around, nothing had been done with the Afghan government, that the Taliban were still just going to sit around and allow that to continue. They weren't going to launch this offensive. They weren't going to win the war, is infantile. And I think there's a lot of that. The outlook towards these wars in the United States, in London, other places, is exactly that, infantile. The idea that this is the fact that this is what defeat looks like, that choosing military victory for almost 2 decades in Afghanistan, and then losing as we did, and offering no other options, pursuing no other avenues, not recognizing the reality of what's occurring there. This is what defeat looks like, and the infantile outbursts against it by many Americans is very telling, I think.
I mean,
I got a lot of. Danny, you're saying something?
I was just gonna say I'm with you on that. I was gonna ask you about the kind of contradictory stuff that we hear about why the Afghan army was falling, because I agree with you. This isn't surprising. I think as a joke, we did an episode a long time ago about Vietnam, and we talked briefly about what would happen if the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, and Henry, kind of hyperbolically said, "Oh well, if we pull out, then in 3 hours the Taliban will take over Kabul." And somebody actually listened to that episode and gave Henry his appropriate
they were like, man, you're such a great you're so great at analysis, and I was like, not really. Like, I just
it's just obvious, right?
A handful of smart people, and I kind of just repeat what they say. But I wanted to ask you about this. So with the Taliban takeover, I actually got a lot of shit for saying this. I said the Taliban are being kind of nice about everything right now. As far as the conquest of Afghanistan, it seemed more like a political conquest. And this is kind of like my perception of how the Taliban are gaining power of all these provinces. Is, they're going and they're saying, hey, listen, we're both good Muslims. That we should have Sharia. Like, let's just join together, or we'll kill you. And it's been mainly just kind of like a political conquest rather than some bloody, barbarian horde going from village to village like ISIS did Western Iraq, where they're, literally cutting people's heads off and eating organs. Like, they seem a lot more crafty and smart about everything than people are portraying.
You're absolutely right, Henry. I mean, spot on. Again, the American commentary so poor on this. And I said this in a piece in CNN in May that the appropriate analogy is not Saigon 1975. It's Mosul 2014. And I'm saying from the perspective of the Taliban, which is something that we never do. We so much American commentary portrays the Taliban, the Iraqi insurgency, the Assad government in Syria, et cetera, all have committed atrocities, of course, all not nice, but we have portrayed them as if they're the
The
villains in
Muslims.
a
It's just the Muslims. That's kind of how
and
they portray
as if with all the nuance of a comic book character. You know, I won't even say a superhero movie character, because I think that the portrayal of villains in superhero movies, Marvel or whatever, is more complex than our understanding of the people we've been fighting in these wars for the last 20 years. You know, so Mosul 2014 through 2017 was the more appropriate example than Saigon, you know, in terms of the Taliban perspective. That's not what the Taliban wanted. They knew exactly that if they took Afghanistan, the cities of Afghanistan, including the capital, the way that the Islamic State did in 2013 through 2017, when they controlled those cities, the result was going to be the same. The American Air Force and American Navy were going to level every city, and that's what they would have. And then not only that, they would have lost all popular support, et cetera, et cetera. And they did exactly like you described, Henry. They recognized that. They also remembered that, you know, when I was over there and I would ask people, how did the Taliban, you know, everyone hates the Taliban. Well, how come they took power so quickly and so easily in the 90s? I mean, they did some fighting and they were good at it, but, you know, it seemed that like in the 90s, same thing too. Entire regions, cities just turned over to them. And the explanation to me was the Pakistani rupee. You know, that's what they used to fight, the Pakistani rupee. And, you know, so certainly the Taliban understood that, and they did exactly as you described. They said, you know, you have a choice. You can either work with us, or you can fight us. And if you work with us, here are the benefits, you know. And you've seen that where the Taliban have put into power and keeping in power many people who were in serious positions of power in the Afghan government. You know what I mean? So basically, just switching allegiances. You know, and the Taliban also too, for most of the last 20 years, it was correct to say that the Taliban were a Pashtun movement, 95% Pashtun or whatever. Pashtuns being the plurality of Afghanistan. One of I think the Afghan constitution recognizes 13 different ethnicities in Afghanistan. But you know, I mean, many more obviously. But you know, Pashtuns being the plurality. And you know, so much of this war has been a U.S. divide and conquer strategy, where the Pashtuns have felt that they are on the wrong side of that divide and conquer strategy, which I agree with them. And so you could, up until this past year or so, you would say that the Taliban were a primarily Pashtun movement, 95% Pashtun or something like that, say. But what you've seen is you have seen many elements of Afghan society that are not Pashtun join the Taliban. Oh, no, I shouldn't say join. Work with the Taliban or passively support the Taliban. Not card-carrying members, but also not going to support the government anymore. We're going to step out of the way and let you guys come through. You're not going to get, you know, if everyone recalls, in June and July, American media was flush with all these videos coming from Afghanistan of all these popular resistance movements that were standing up to fight the Taliban. That was all bullshit. It was all propaganda. It was all getting people together, giving them weapons, paying them some money, and then filming them, you know, and then they went home. I mean, but that's the level of the war. That's the reality of how much this war has been. You know, so with regards to say, you know, so what we did, you know, is in 2001, we take out of power a theocratic repressive government, put in power a kleptocratic repressive government, both of which have preyed on the people in different ways, but have preyed on the people. And now, at this point, it is untenable. This kleptocratic repressive government is so predatory, so brutal, that people who are not from the traditional populace or constituency of the Taliban, and remember, this is a 40-plus year long civil war, so there's a lot of enmity, a lot of revenge, a lot of trauma, a lot of memories. People are saying, you know what, as bad as the Taliban are, maybe they are a better solution right now than this predatory government of warlords that we have. I mean, so you've seen that switch as well, not just the people who have gone over to the Taliban and work with them, but I think also among the population in a passive manner. Again, they're not signing, you know, they're not signing union cards with the Taliban or anything like that, but you know, in a passive manner, saying at this point the Taliban are preferable, and of course that runs completely counter narrative to American narratives of the war. It's impossible, basically, under American narratives of the war for something like this to happen, because this has basically been a Manichaean, at least in terms of the messaging, a Manichaean struggle of good versus evil. So how is this possible that people are actually, even if it's passive support, supporting the Taliban? So you have this, I think that's why you've seen some of the hysteria you have seen in the American media among American commentary, right? Mm-hmm. Because the narrative has so been destroyed. And then you see other things too with if people struggle with the idea of manufacturing consent, I mean, the great phrase that most of us know from Noam Chomsky about how the media manufactures consent. I think looking at CNN's coverage of the last couple of weeks in Kabul is exactly how best to understand manufacturing consent. Seeing how Clarissa Ward covered the Taliban capture of the city and their victory. I mean, everything was done, was presented in a way to show it as this doomsday event, to prove all the narratives of the Taliban correct. So she is dressed completely in black, very strict Islamic garb, only her face is showing. To the point even that CNN publishes video where Clarissa Ward says the Taliban are chanting "Death to America," and Afghans, and others who speak Dari or Pashto. I'm not sure which one they were chanting, and probably in Pashto, I would assume. I don't know, who knows? But they're saying basically they were not chanting "Death to America." They were chanting other things, but it was not "Death to America" or anything similar. So you had that manufactured consent, and then with Clarissa Ward, blonde hair, blue-eyed. Well, you tune into Al Jazeera English, and you've got Charlotte Bellis, also blonde hair, blue-eyed. Charlotte Bellis, who is wearing just basically a scarf over her head. Her blonde hair is spilling out all over the place. She's wearing the same clothing she's always worn in Kabul, hasn't changed her clothes at all, just wearing a shirt and pants basically. And she is walking around freely. She was the first person the Taliban called on in their first press conference. You contrast what Charlotte Bellis is reporting and how she is reporting to what Clarissa Ward and CNN are reporting, and I think you get a really good understanding for how manufacturing consent works. The one thing I know you guys brought up, and I've been yammering on about these things, but with the Afghan government and the Afghan army, their collapse, absolutely, it built a house of cards. I mean, has anyone seen a house of cards ever collapse in any other manner than, right? I mean, rapid. You had it reminds me of what Patrick Coburn said about the Iraqi army in 2014. The Iraqi army was not an army, it was a business venture. And that's exactly what the Afghan army, and it makes sense. I mean, it's the same military. I mean, these militaries were built by the same power. And if you get into even further detail about it, if you want to get into like the minds of those who created this, who created this government, who created this American exercise and experiment in Afghanistan, which is, if we go back 15 years, 2004, 2003, 2005, this was the American experiment in democracy, or democracy's experiment in the Muslim world, right? This is a proof of concept for so many American neoconservatives. But you have to remember that American empire is built on extraction, right? Why do we have empires? Well, to extract from others. I mean, George Kennan says it best back in 1947 or 48. The United States, after World War II, the United States has more than half the world's wealth, and we have less than 5% of the world's population. The goal of every successive presidential administration will be to maintain that inequality. I mean, this is the purposes of empire. So I think when you go into a country and try and rebuild it, to do nation building, it's going to look like you look, right? So you're going to build this extractive government, which is, again, you're putting warlords and drug lords in power. The Afghan army, people are probably familiar now, supposedly 350,000 strong, anywhere from 100,000 to 200,000 of those were ghost soldiers, meaning they were just padding on the payroll. They didn't exist. They were just names on a list for commanders to get more pay. So what happens is you got a system like that, a machine like that, where it is a business-making venture, where people are solely doing it to make money for the most part. Not to say that there weren't some Afghans in that military that were fighting and did fight because they believed in what they were doing. But the bulk of it, the way it was constructed in this way, that as soon as the money runs out, or the threat of money runs out, it's going to fall apart. Look, Afghanistan, 70% of Afghans live on less than $1 a day. 90% live on less than $2 a day. When the Afghan police and the Afghan military are paying $150 to $200 a month, men are going to join that, and women. There were some women in these things are going to join that because their families need the money to survive.
Right.
When that money stops showing up, they're not going to continue fighting. They're going to walk away. I mean, so the
transactional relationship.
It's transactional, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and you had that as soon as, and we hear it wasn't even that the Afghan army wasn't being paid these last few months, that they weren't even being fed, that nothing was showing up to them. Mm-hmm. I mean, so, it's very understandable when you understand how this government and military was created, how it functioned, and what the purposes of it were, as well as who we populated it with. I mean, you got to remember that the Secretary of Defense, the Minister of Defense for Afghanistan for many years under Hamid Karzai was a guy named Marshal Fahim. Marshal Fahim was the biggest drug lord in northern Afghanistan. And we gave this man helicopters and airplanes. What do you think he did with those? He didn't use those to fight the Taliban. He used those to ferry drugs. I mean, so we knew this. I mean, this was a man that, as Minister of Defense, and you can look this up, the New York Times did a huge story on this in like 2007 or 2008. As Minister of Defense, the United States government, because he was a war criminal, an acknowledged drug lord and everything, the U.S. government could not directly interact with him. But this was the person we were okay with being the Minister of Defense. I mean, right? So this is the whole thing. It's when you understand how it was constructed, the way it was upheld, who populated it. I think the accurate question is like, how did it last this long? I think that's a good, how did it last this long?
So maybe we can end with our last couple minutes here. And by the way, I just want to again thank you for this. This has been super fun. But maybe we can talk like a fun hypothetical situation. So let's say we have the ability to send you back in time, right? Like we gathered 4 time crystals, and lets us open up a portal to the past, and let's also say that we gave you the ability to directly influence the course of history. I'm wondering, like, how would you change it on the Afghanistan war? I mean, other than the obvious, just straight up avoiding it. What would you do different if you were Obama, or if you could, sway Obama or Trump or Biden or anyone else, that was involved in this? What's your play?
I think it's acknowledge that this hasn't worked, acknowledge that it's not going to work, and that there are other options. So again, the Taliban, as I said earlier, in the discussion, the Taliban are willing to negotiate. I mean, it's clear. 2016, people can go back and look. December 2016, the New York Times runs a huge story where basically breaks this story that the Norwegians in 2007, 2008 had been meeting with Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban. Supposedly, according to the West and according to Western intelligence and all the serious thinkers, Mullah Omar had never met with anyone who was from the West. This story completely shows just one more example of how these people don't know what they're talking about. But anyway, the Norwegians got to the point by end of 2008 or so that the Taliban had agreed to a peace settlement, and it was basically flushed because the Americans wanted victory. I mean, so and all kinds of things like that occurred. A lot of discussion right now, thankfully, about how the Taliban offered to surrender in 2001. I mean, Rumsfeld acknowledging that. So this is not revisionist, as some people in D.C. are saying. It's not. This was reported at the time, by the major American media, the same major American media that has cheerled for these wars. So anytime, this is why I have a subscription to the New York Times. Because they actually do sometimes publish things and report things that are really important, because it runs so counter to the narrative that their own editorial board publishes and promotes. You have this reporting sometimes that is really great reporting. And that's the best counterfactual, I think, when you can cite a source like the Times or the Washington Post that has been, again, cheerleaders for these wars for the most part, when their own reporting demolishes that cheerleading. But I mean, so you have this acknowledgement that, yeah, there were opportunities to do this. So I think that would be it. I mean, I think understanding that the United States military in these wars military occupation, the idea of victory, of using proxy forces, because that's the way the United States, particularly since Barack Obama, has been waging these wars. Through proxy forces, using CIA, special operations, drones, which are all secret, right, classified. That means that the United States government doesn't even have to lie about what we're doing, say, in Africa or in Yemen or in Syria or whatever, because there's your secret activities. So the United States government actually has an obligation not to talk about them. Using contractors. I don't think most people know that. I think many people are familiar with 7,000 Americans killed in combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not so many people familiar with the figure that 8,000 contractors have been killed in these wars. These contractors doing jobs that in previous wars they would have been wearing military uniforms, but because we've privatized warfare, outsourced it, contractors were doing those jobs and they were killed. So the actual total of killed in these wars is not 7,000, it's really like 15,000. And then you add in the suicides of combat veterans.
Right.
Just combat veterans alone, you're looking at more than 10,000 suicides probably.
Right.
So really the cost of these wars in terms of American debt are about 25,000, not 7,000. So, but anyway, the idea of using these proxy forces, especially because proxies, if brown people are killing brown people, black people are killing black people, the United States media not really going to report on that. When there's mass atrocity, they will, but for the most part, they won't. American politicians won't care, and the American public won't notice. And if they do,
MSNBC went a full year without covering Yemen, or
Yeah.
a year and a half, or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
ridiculous.
Meanwhile, she covered. I remember this stuff. They talked about Stormy Daniels like I forget some crazy percentage of the time, right? So they do talk about what is occurring there. It's under the framework of these black people have always been killing each other. These brown people, they've been fighting for centuries, right? Is that complete, which is completely untrue.
But, when Obama said that the Sunni Shia was a 1,000-year war that was just continuing on today, and that was his level of understanding of the region. Like, they've been fighting forever.
Exactly. What do you expect of those people, right? There's a racist element to these wars that I don't think is properly understood, and it's one thing that can really help people understand how the United States wars overseas are mirrored in what you would call the wars here at home, right? The war on drugs, especially say mass incarceration. There are very real linkages between, in the particularly when you understand the philosophies that underlie these policies and these strategies. So, getting back to it though, is it recognizing that, look, this is not causing us to win. This is causing chaos. This is causing instability. This is actually, invading and occupying Afghanistan, we go into Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda is 400 people at most, 400 people total, at most, around the world on September 12th, 2001. They just lost 19 of them the day before. Al-Qaeda, over the last 20 years, has grown to have tens and tens of thousands of direct members, let alone how many hundreds of thousands of people who have supported them from afar or passively or just indirectly.
B brands. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And not only that, they have controlled entire cities and regions. They still control Idlib province in Syria. Right? So the idea that somehow these wars were successful, another number is that in 2001, the U.S. government says there are 4 international terrorist groups or organizations in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And now the United States government says there are 20 such groups. So the consequences of these wars, not just Afghanistan, but say our policies in Pakistan with regards to Pakistan, have led to a 5-fold increase in terror groups, right? And not just in that region, but you look at AFRICOM. The United States in 2008 stands up Africa Command, is going to give Africa its own U.S. military presence, attention. You're going to put a 4-star general in charge of it and all the accoutrements that go around it. So in 2008 in Africa, there were about 300 terror attacks that year. In 2020, there were almost 5,000 terror attacks in Africa, 12 years after Africa Command stood up.
Yikes.
I know there's somebody out there right now, and I'm gonna be nice, who's saying right now, well, correlation is not causation. Like, give me a break. You give me a fucking break. You know, I mean, when we know that, look, when I resigned, I don't know why it happened, if it had any coincidence, you know, I don't know. But in September, who knows? In September of 2009, when I resigned, someone in the U.S. intelligence community leaked a document. You can still find this now. Is Boston Globe wrote about this in September 2009, that U.S. intelligence understood that 90% of the Taliban were fighting the United States, not because they were inspired religiously, that they were on some kind of great jihadist journey, but simply because they were occupied by a foreign power. 90% of the Taliban. I could tell you the same exact thing. I saw the intelligence in Iraq, used to read it, you know, as well as this was written about as well around 2008 or so. Some folks wrote about this, that the Iraqi insurgency, 95% of the Iraqi insurgency was nationalist. It was because of being occupied. And we know this too. The United Nations did a study of African militant groups, you know, what we call jihadist groups, you know. This was a few years ago. And this big study, really well done by the United Nations, finds that about 75%, at least 75%, of those who join militia groups in Africa, insurgency groups, are doing so as a result of violence inflicted upon their families or their friends by foreign forces or by the proxy governments or groups that are backed by foreign forces. There's a very real cause and effect here. So getting back to your, I'm in my time machine or whatever, yeah, I mean, that would be it. We'll be recognizing that the fuel that is causing this instability, this destruction, the thing that is pushing people into these insurgencies is, you know, the U.S. foreign presence, is the U.S. war on terror, is the support of proxy. I mean, look at Egypt. I mean, Ayman Zawahiri, who is the number 2 in Al Qaeda, who is still, or actually number 1 since we killed Bin Laden in 2011, who has never been caught. Who most people who understand Al Qaeda would say, yeah, you know, Bin Laden was the front guy. You know, he was very charismatic, had a presence to him. You know, he was the number 1. But the brains behind the scene was Zawahiri. You know, why does he join Al Qaeda? Because the Egyptian government that the United States supports, you know, brutally suppresses people like him, jails them, tortures him, to the point that it causes a man like Zawahiri to make his life's work revenge against, those who are doing such things. And the best way to get revenge against the Egyptian government is to go after those who are keeping up and supporting and propping up the Egyptian government. I mean, so the blowback in all this, whether it's direct or indirect, you know, that's what I would address.
Interesting. Well, I really appreciate all that. Henry, do you have any more questions before we cut?
I certainly do, but in the spirit of time, I know you have some other interviews lined up later today, but we could obviously talk to you for several more hours. We hope to have you on the show again soon. This has been a great episode, and you know, thank you for coming on and sharing all this. I think it's gonna be really valuable for everyone. Maybe one last thing. I know that you've been vocal and supportive of you know, veterans who are having a hard time, and you know, I know a lot of veterans are kind of. What would you say to a veteran who's listening right now, who's just like having struggles or issues right now? Because I just know that that's something that's important to you.
Yeah, I know. I mean, for people, just people understand. I mean, I have traumatic brain injury. I have issues with serious alcohol issues. I have post-traumatic stress disorder. I have moral injury. You know, also what's called perpetration-induced traumatic stress. I deal with depression because of those things. I deal with anger because of those things. Look, my TBI was so bad I wasn't able to earn a paycheck for 5 years. Like, you know, my marriage. The woman who I thought was, and the woman who I wanted to be with me when I died, you know, the last thing I wanted to see on this earth was her. Destroyed that relationship, you know, I mean, like, so I am a living consequence of these wars, you know. And I say that to let other people know that I've been there and I am there. And the one thing I will say to anyone who is going through that is, if you're thinking about it at all, then you need help. If it has, I mean, first of all, if someone says to you or you've done something, it's caused an event that has caused a problem, you definitely need help. But if you've even gotten to the point in your head where just for a second, the thought flashed in your head that I need help, then you need help. And you have to get professional help. That is the one thing I will say. I will always say, you cannot do this on your own. You cannot do this with your friends. You cannot certainly do this with a bottle, but or a needle. You need professional help. And that is that. I'll leave it at that for the sake of time. People can contact me. I'm on Twitter, Matthew P. Ho, P as in Patrick. I've got a website, matthewho.com. My email's on there, and saying this for if you guys need help, if someone wants to talk, advice, suggestions, please. And I say this also to the family and friends. So many guys are alive. Hey, the reason why I never put that gun in my mouth and blew the back of my head off was simply because there was a woman who loved me, who got me into treatment, and many professionals who helped me. That's it. If not for them, I would be dead. By my own hand, right? I would have killed myself. So if you're out there listening and you have someone you love who is going through this, feel free to contact me. Call the Veterans Crisis Line. Call the VA. Find other resources. There are a lot of people out there who can help. And if you get into help, the evidence is there that if you get into help, you have a much, much greater chance of survival than if you don't. We know this. Veterans who are in healthcare, who are receiving treatment, are much less likely to blow the back of their heads off than guys who are not getting treatment.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for this, and we'll hopefully do this again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate it. Anytime, and thank you for thank you for running this kind of podcast. And long form and talking about. You guys, maybe you're not seeing it now, but you and others who are doing this type of journalism, you're making a difference. And it may not be obvious for another 10 or 20 years, but this type of discussion, this type of information, this is making a difference and will make a difference. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks.
Oh, well, we appreciate that. And
just two guys.
We're trying.
Doing our best.
We're trying to basically mask a kind of funny, bro history. Is this drunk history? And then kind of put the red pill in
That's
there.
what I thought when you guys contacted me. I was like, all right, but yeah, certainly, yeah.
All right. See you next week, guys.
Peace.